Hi, welcome back to the third part of this terrain tutorial series. In this series, we're looking at how can we take LiDAR data, which is extremely accurate and based on it's a real world height map. And then we've looked at, in the previous video, how do we extract splat maps or weight maps, which we use to define where we're going to apply the different textures on our terrain. So you can see as I look at this terrain here, we've got all of these nice flow lines. We've picked out some of these ridges here as well. And this all comes from Houdini, where we've imported the LiDAR data, and then we've started applying different masks to the landscape and applied a flow simulation over the top of it. We've pulled out this data here, which we're going to use to drive the blending of the terrain material that we're going to create today. So if you haven't watched the first two parts yet, or just the last part, I'd recommend you go back and check them out as part of this playlist here that I'm just going to link up in the top right of the video. So check that out if you haven't seen it already, and promise you'll be getting up to this in no time. It's just half an hour for each of those videos, and then you can pick up this video where those two left off. So this video today is going to be looking at how do we create material for the terrain. Actually, we're going to be looking at how not to create the terrain material. We're going to look at how not to do it, two different ways of not doing a terrain material before we actually look at the kind of, I suppose, the final product, the method that I'm going to recommend you use. Now, to be clear, just because I'm going to recommend that you use this method, the method I will suggest at the end, towards the latter half of this video, I'm going to take you through two other methods, which are the more traditional ways, which are two more traditional ways of approaching a terrain material. So the first way that we're going to approach creating this terrain material, which is the best way, I think, for a beginner to just get to grips with how terrain materials work in their basics, is we're just going to start building on that terrain material we created last time. So I'm going to select the terrain. I'm going to double click on the little icon there, the little display thumbnail of the beginner landscape we created. And in here, you can see that we've got these four material attributes nodes, these make material attributes nodes. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to set up effectively a unique material for each of these, and then they're going to get passed through to this blend material attributes here. And then we're using this landscape layer sample node, which we've called grass, and that's going to take this layer grass and apply that wherever this weight is on the terrain. So it's very easy for us to see where these weights are applied because we've already colored those inside of the material. That's what this vector parameter here is doing, called grass tint. And the same is true of the rock tint and the sediment tint. But another way of looking at where the layers are getting distributed, if your setup is a little bit more complex, so you can press Shift-2, switch to landscape editing mode. I should mention here that you can actually just go up to this modes panel here and pick your mode manually. Shift-2 is just a little bit faster. You can cycle through all of the different editor modes very quickly with that. And we're going to go Shift-2, go to the landscape editing panel, and we're going to go now to this where it says lit, and we're going to go down to landscape visualizers, and we're going to pick landscape layer debug. And that's going to show nothing to begin with. It's just going to be all black, and that's because we haven't actually said what color we want to visualize each layer with. So you see, if we turn off that visualizer, go back to normal, you're going to see that these layers don't have any additional info other than the name. But if we turn it back on, we're going to get these, I'll do that again because I missed the button. You're going to see that we get these RGB checkboxes. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit R, G, and B. And you can see that we're now, oops, I hit Shift-1. So that's a habit that I need to break out of. I need to go back and re-enable those visualizers now. So there we go, back to layer debug. And you can see we're getting basically the same, it's just applying a different color to each of those weight maps. And you can only do 3 at a time, but this is really, really useful once you've set up more layers and you just want to visualize the influence that each one is having or how each one is distributed. So that's just something useful to bear in mind there. I'm going to hit Shift-1 to jump out of the landscape editing mode back to normal. And you can see we've got those same splat maps represented by the coloring in the material. So, okay, we're going to just basically, for the start, we're going to take where we've plugged in our tint, and instead we're just going to plug in some textures. And we're going to do that for each of these layers. And in that manner, we're going to quickly set up the most basic kind of landscape material. But first, in order to do that, we need to get a hold of some textures. So I'm going to use the Quixel Megascans library using the Bridge application. So I imagine you've heard of this already, but if you haven't, Quixel is a company that is part of Epic. It's a part of Epic, and it made its name making collecting lots of scanned surfaces and objects from the real world. And that's where you, and this bridge application is where you can get access to that, and it's all completely free. Since Epic brought out Quixel, you have full access to the entire library, and it contains literally thousands, if not tens of thousands. Actually, it says 15,000. 15,989 as of the 9th of November 2021, different assets, including surfaces and 3D props. So you can use all of this, and it's all free, completely gratuitous. What's the word I'm trying to search for here? Not gratuitous. I don't know what word I'm trying to find there, but you can use it free of charge. So that's what I'm going to do here. You just need to search, if you want to get a hold of it yourself, just search Quixel Bridge. It takes you to the website. And since you have an Epic account, you can just log in with that and download it here. So, okay, we're going to go to the bridge application, and we're just going to find a few different surfaces that we want to use. I'm going to go to my local library. So these are files I've already downloaded, and I'm going to go to surfaces, and we're going to have a quick little look for grass. And I'm going to go ahead and hit export on this one. And I'm going to go ahead and hit export on this one. It's just going to queue all of those up. I want to have a nice sort of like a kind of a wide selection just while I'm playing around with these, so I can pick the right one once I'm in Unreal. And you'll notice if we jump back over to Unreal, it's importing all of those. Now at this point, I should mention that it's only importing those files because I've got the Megascans link plugin installed. So in order to set that up, you just want to go and check your plugins folder and just have a quick little look for Megascans. And if you see that in there, you can just quickly enable it, which will require a restart of the editor. But if you haven't got it in there, if you haven't got the option, if you haven't got this icon up here, you'll actually need to go into the bridge application, and then you see this little settings kind of icon down here. We'll click that, go to export settings, and you're going to need to set up your export target to be Unreal. You're going to have to choose the engine version of the project that you're currently working in. You're then going to have to navigate to the location on disk of your engine install. So that for me would be program files, Epic Games, UE 4.27, and then where do we do it? In the engine plugins folder. So then you hit select folder, and you can also then set the default project to the root folder of the project that you're currently working in. Provided you've done that and you've got the plugin enabled in the project, then and you see this icon here, then when you go ahead inside of Bridge to export an asset by pressing the export button, it will fire that over to Unreal after a small delay. And that works with the 3D props as well. So there, if you dive inside of this surfaces folder, you're going to see we've got all of those. It's dead quick, really fast way to get some high quality textures onto your terrain or wherever else you want to use them. Now, I am going to add a little caveat to that, which is that terrain textures can be a little bit peculiar, and the Megascans library of textures are mostly 2x2 or 1x1 meters, which is very small. So they're only going to cover a very, 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 very small portion of the terrain, right? You can imagine if I drag in a cube, this is going to be the area that the texture covers, and then it's going to repeat. This is going to introduce some very noticeable repetition. So with terrain textures, you actually want to go away and generally author your own custom terrain textures. Now you can do that in Mixer using a combination of textures here, but we're not going to do that today. We're going to basically just accept that there's going to be a little bit of tiling, and we'll cover how you create your own kind of custom, or you mix your own terrain textures in a future workshop. And as you're going to see, we're going to be able to get some results that already look pretty good without taking that extra step. Okay, so we've got all of these in here now. So how do we go about applying them in the material? Well, I'm going to select the terrain. I'm going to double click it again to open it up. I'm just going to pull this over so it's covering half my screen there. And then I'm just going to go and pick the grass that I want to apply. I'm not sure which one I want. Maybe this grass wild, maybe patchy wild grass. What else have we got? Let's go for that patchy wild grass. I'm going to pull in the normal, the albedo. I'm going to control click and the roughness. Let's go for the ambient occlusion as well. Let's pull in all of those there. And then you're going to get all of these texture samples, and you're going to have to plug in all of these into the corresponding pins on the Make Material Attributes. So I'm going to get the albedo. I'm going to plug that into the base color. I'm going to get the normal. I'm going to plug that into the normal there. I'm going to get the, what's this one? This is the roughness. and the ambient occlusion, and so on. So I'm going to plug in the ambient occlusion too. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to hit apply right off of the mark there. And we'll see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and save all of these mega scans as well in case I have a crash. Now I've made an error here because I've tried to save the project while compiling shaders, and that causes Unreal to freeze up. But okay, it didn't take too long. So okay, that's the texture, and if we zoom in on it, you can see, oh yeah, there we go. There's that tiling that we were talking about. So yeah, it's not looking too great, not off of the bat like that. It's looking a little bit kind of bland and a little bit washed out, but it's a first step at least. So what we could do now is we could apply the tint like this here, and we could plug in that to the base color, and then we could go ahead and also let's grab a landscape coordinate node. So this is going to get the coordinates of the landscape. We're just going to select the landscape and go and see what resolution it is. It's 4033, so that's 4K. So I need to put in the mapping scale for this 4033. I'm going to get a multiply. Actually, I'm not going to get a multiply. I'm just going to leave that for now. And then I'm going to take the output of that and plug it into the UVs. So, and by the way, I forgot to mention, when I drop in this multiply node like that, I'm just holding M on the keyboard and left clicking. That's how you get that multiply just quickly there. And you can do that for a few different node types in Unreal. So, okay, we've changed the mapping scale. What happens now if we hit apply? All right, so this time we've got something a little bit different. And what's happening here, it looks way better when you zoom out with this new mapping scale, is it's just applying that material once across the whole landscape, I believe. So we need to apply a scale factor to that. So what I'm going to do again is I'm going to hold M on the keyboard, and I'm going to then control click all of these pins from the landscape coordinates and drop them out here. That allows me to reroute them. I'm going to take the output of the landscape coordinates, put it into the A input of the multiply, and then I'm going to hold S on the keyboard and left click to create a scalar parameter. And I'm going to call this mapping scale. I'm going to set that to 1 by default. Set that to 1. And now if we change that value, you can see we're influencing, it's quite hard to see actually, but if I zoom in, you'll be able to see that we're able to influence the scale of the texture as it's applied to the landscape. And if we go in and just press F11 to go out of full screen, I'm going to switch to my modes panel again. I'm going to drop in a cube. We're going to see that this cube, the scale of the texture is a little bit more appropriate. It's still not right, I'm going to be honest, but you would want it to be scaled up down a lot smaller than that, so that you as a person roughly 2 meters tall or 1.8 meters tall, that's going to be like when you look down, it's going to feel like the right scale. So you can see it needs to be even more small than that. And when you go to this kind of scale, repetition is going to become pretty obvious. He says, actually, this is doing an all right job because the splat map's introducing the breaks and the texture frequently enough that you don't see the repetition, which is great. And again, another good reason to take this route and actually bake out your splat maps. But anyway, I don't want to go that. I don't want to go that for now. I'm going to make it look good from far away for the time being on the macro scale. So we're going to make it tile we're going to multiply the tiling factor by 50. We get some interesting detail from this far away. But we've only done one layer so far. So now what we want to do is we want to take this whole setup basically, and we want to copy it down. We're going to plug it into the rock here. So let's just delete that grass tint over there and delete that grass comment box. And I'm going to drag that rock over and that rock tint and plug it in here. And then I'm going to control click to drag and replace that. And then I can delete the old material attributes. So now we've created a rock layer. But we're going to have to set up the textures here too. So let's do that very quickly, and let's go and find some interesting rocks if we can. Icelandic cliff, maybe. Yeah, let's go for the Icelandic cliff. That looks quite interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to plug in the with both the content browser and the material visible. I'm going to left click the texture sample. I'm going to click the albedo and I'm going to apply that there. I'm going to left click the normal, apply that to the normal channel. I'm going to left click the roughness and apply that in there. And now I'm going to do the same for the ambient occlusion as well. And we're going to hit apply again. Now, as you might have picked up on already, as you might have noticed, this is kind of a laborious way of working. It's quite labor intensive. And every time we want to make a significant change to the material, we have to go ahead and recompile it, and it takes a while. And it's just really not the best way of working. So what we're going to do now at this stage instead is we're going to go to our material. I'm going to browse to it in the content browser, and we're going to create a material instance. So a material instance, I'm going to prefix that with MI for material instance. Material instance is an interface for working with a material, which is greatly simplified. You don't have that big node interface anymore, and you're only working with the parameters that you've chosen to expose to the artist or to yourself. So this makes working with and making variations on terrain materials a lot faster. And we're going to work with this from now on. And you can see we've got access to the tints and the mapping scale in here, and we can apply that globally for the whole terrain. He says, let's have a little look. That's not working. So what have I missed? I've clearly missed something there. So I need to jump back into the landscape and let's have a little look. And the problem is what? You know, I'm not entirely sure what the problem is there. So I'm just going to be, for the avoidance of doubt, because I didn't need to duplicate this part, I'm going to control click that, pull that over there and delete. So now we have just one mapping coordinate, mapping scale, scalar input there, and then the one landscape coordinates. Perhaps you're only allowed one landscape coordinates inside of your material. That's not, don't quote me on that. I don't know if that's the problem there. Just stumbled across this little issue here. And I've done something even more foolish than that. I just simply forgot to apply the material to the terrain. So if I go to the details panel, I'm going to go and just left click and drag the MI landscape beginner, drop that onto the landscape material tab there. And now indeed, if we go in here and start playing with that value, you're going to notice it updates on the terrain, which is what we want. Okay, so we've assigned textures for the rocks, which is on those kind of peaky areas, those ridge lines, and we've assigned a grass texture. We haven't assigned one for the kind of sediment layer yet, and we could go ahead and copy this all over and make that again. But what happens if we want to change the textures inside of the material instance? What if we say, okay, well, this is great. We want to have like a grassy biome, and we want to like have this set of textures for that. But what happens if you want to make a few variations and you want to have a desert biome or a snow biome? Well, you're going to have to go back into your master material, and you're going to have to go through laboriously and plug in the new textures to each of these samples. And this is just not the way that we should be working. It's going to be very slow. It's going to be less optimized, and I'm just going to straight up say it's the wrong way to do it. What we need to do is we need to expose these parameters, these textures, to the material instance. Now, that's fine, and it works. And we could do that for all of these nodes, and they would all be visible inside of this editing panel. The problem is that we would have to go through, and for every single new layer that we created, so let's say, for example, we decide we want to have 7 or 8 layers on our landscape, you have to name every single parameter a different name, and then you have to look through a list of all of these parameters. And that's not to mention, maybe we want to assign a different scale to each of those layers, and then you have to introduce another multiply node. You have to do that for every single one of these. You have to add a new scalar parameter to multiply by. What if we want to do some additional blending with another texture? You have to do the same exact thing, and you have to create that new layer, that new texture sample for every layer. So it's incredibly laborious, and thankfully there's smarter ways of working. So if you want to go down this route, I don't want to put you off doing it, especially if your landscape's going to be simple, because it can be helpful to visualize all of everything that you're doing just inside of one material graph. Especially if you're a beginner, it's going to keep things extremely clear, and you're going to know where you've put things. You're not going to get lost. You're not going to get confused, and it's hugely valuable as a beginner to just have that kind of degree of like visibility of what you're doing. But we can be a little bit smarter. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take advantage of something called a material function. Wouldn't it be great if there was a way to just make the logic once, plug in the different textures that you wanted into that material function, and then whenever you update the logic, it updates for all the layers at the same time. So that's what we're going to do now. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to right click and we're going to create a new material function. So we're going to call that MF landscape layer. We're going to load it up. We're going to go into go back into the master material, and we're going to copy the tint, the multiply, the make material attributes, texture samples, and we're going to grab that just for one of the layers. And we're going to take that in here, and then we're going to set that up like so. I'm going to plug that into the output, and then if we hit apply, once we've plugged that in for the first time, jump back into the MI landscape beginner. what we're going to do is we're going to go and create an material function call. There we go. And because we just created that material function, it's already selected in the content browser. If that didn't work, then you just have to search through with this material function selected. You just have to search through and find that MF landscape layer that we created. You can see it's already got an output pin. So what I could do is I could just replace this here, and that's going to be the landscape layer with those grass textures applied and that tint, but no tiling because we haven't plugged that in. Without the modification to the mapping scale, I should say. And it's going to take a moment to update. Working with landscapes can be quite slow, especially as you add more and more layers. These compiles take a long time, especially if you don't have such a powerful machine. So you can see that's achieved largely the same result. We've got that grass texture being applied there, although the tiling's wrong. So now we're just going to go in and we're going to rehook up all of those controls that allow us to sort of tweak it. And this is where the power of material functions comes in, because we can make a function input, and we're going to call this input a tint, and it's going to be a vector because we want it to be a vector. We want a color is a vector. It's got 3 channels. We're going to convert this grass tint inside of the material function into a constant, because this is no longer going to be a parameter that actually controls the tint. But we're going to put it in as the preview value because the function inputs ask for a preview. We're then going to go and we're going to set that to a default value of white, like so. And then we're going to put that back into the multiply pin. And if we hit apply now, just on the function, not on the landscape, go back into the landscape, you're going to see it's now created a tint input. So we can take that tint and plug it in here. So what we're doing now is we're building the setup in such a way where the material function is going to take a set of inputs and then it's going to operate on them in some way. Okay, so let's jump back inside of here and let's create a new input. We're going to create a texture 2D input, so a reference to a texture, and we're going to do that for each of these texture layers. I'm going to call this one color. I'm going to call this one normal. This one is the roughness, I believe. Yes, this is the roughness. And then finally, the AO. And remember I said it asks for a preview value. So what we're going to do is we're going to hook in a preview value. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to make a texture object. And we're going to leave that for the color as the default texture. For the normal, we're going to search something called base flatten normal map. For the roughness, we're going to get white, just a plain white square. So that means basically it's fully rough. And for the AO, no appearance occlusion. So those are kind of blank presets there, just like this white. I'm going to go ahead and hit apply. Now, if you couldn't find those textures, for example, you can't find the base flatten normal map, you can't find the white square texture, you may need to go down into the content browser, and you'll see that at the bottom right, it says view options. Well, you may need to hit the view options and go and click show engine content, because I've currently got that enabled. I've also got plugin content enabled. So if I just minimize the content browser, you're going to see that possibly by default, you're only going to have the content browser. So in order to see all that extra content, you just need to tick show engine content. And this contains a whole load of useful things when you're creating tools like this, like landscape material blueprints. So back into the landscape beginner. And you can see it's throwing up an error. And the error is simply a result of the fact that we haven't plugged in the inputs that it's asking for. We can go ahead and delete this multiply and make material attributes because they're no longer relevant. But that tint we want to keep because it's plugged into the tint node there. Now you might think that we could just go ahead and take the output of these textures and plug them in to the function, but you would be wrong. And that's because this is a texture sample. So it's looking for a texture object, which we can see is referenced down there, and it's already sampling it and converting it into a vector. This is a bit of a layman's explanation, but it's basically taking the information from the texture and putting it into a format which can then be applied to the terrain. That's maybe a helpful way of thinking about it. So this is sampling here. But if you remember back in the landscape layer function we created, this is also a sample. So you can't sample a sample. You actually just need to grab a reference to the texture object directly. So we've got that as a preview value in here, but for the real value that we want to assign to this layer, we need to go back into the M landscape beginner and we need to create a new texture object. So a texture object is just like a texture sample in the sense that it will get you a reference to the texture object, but then you actually have to go ahead and manually sample it afterwards as well, like that. So that's all that we're doing there. Now, I could go ahead and I could hard code these textures into the texture objects, just like I did with the texture samples. But remember, we set up a material instance. And what if we want to make a desert biome? We want to expose those as parameters that the end artist can modify at the end of the day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click that texture object. I'm going to hit convert to parameter. You could also just search natively a texture object parameter. And let's call that parameter grass color. And let's just go ahead and plug that into the color and then hit apply. It's going to give you a warning because we've currently got compilation errors, but don't worry, we'll fix those in a moment. Now, if we go back to the material instance, you'll see it's created a reference to this material, this grass color texture parameter, and it's called it grass color. So this is really helpful. We're going to do this for each of our layers. We're going to create a grass. I'm going to actually delete that. I'm going to base it. No, I'm not. I'm going to keep going as I was. Okay, so grass color. We're going to call this grass normal, and then we're going to get the normal there. And by hitting this search icon, it's going to select it in the content browser. I can then click this grass normal node over here and apply it like that. So I plug that in here, and I create another copy. I'm going to call this one grass roughness, and you could do the same, so on and so on for each of those layers. So I'm going to click the search icon. I'm going to plug it in there, and then I'm going to do the same thing, but this time for the AO. I need to rename it to AO before I plug in the texture. Otherwise, if you forget to rename the node before plugging in the texture, then it's actually going to change the texture for both of these. So you would end up with the AO overwriting the roughness, and then you might end up with a result you're not expecting. So that could be a little bit confusing. So be sure to rename the node and then apply the new texture to it. So we've created our texture object parameters now, which can be changed in the material instance, which get fed into the material function, which gets sampled. We create the material attributes, we output the material attributes, and then that gets sent in to the blend material attributes just in place of doing that all here, like we had previously. Now, at this stage, we can delete the texture samples that we created before, and you might notice that there's something missing. And the thing that's missing is the fact that we haven't plugged in the coordinates or the tiling. And you'll also see that these texture objects don't give us the option for tiling. There's no UV input. So we need to go back into our function. We need to create a new input. I'm going to call this input mapping scale. And then we're going to change that to a vector 2 because mapping scale only happens in 2 dimensions. I'm going to plug that into the UVs. We're going to hit apply. Continue to save this. And then we can take the output of the landscape coordinates multiplied by the mapping scale and put that in here to the mapping scale. So we're back where we were, and you might be wondering what was the advantage of that. Well, the advantage is we can now copy this node down here, and we can do the same thing for each of these layers. So we plug this in here. We'll need to grab all of those and convert them to and convert these to texture objects. So there's click convert to texture objects, convert to parameter, and then we can plug in the color. We can plug in the so I believe this is, so I'll call this, I will actually name it just for the sake of this demonstration, rock color, rock normal, rock roughness, rock AO. There we go. I'll plug each of those in to the corresponding pin. Delete this make material attributes. And make sure the rock tint is plugged in. Make sure the mapping scale is plugged in. And clearly my textures have been overwritten here, so I messed something up there. So I'm going to have to quickly go and find that rock texture I was using again and select it in the content browser. And you can actually just drag that in here for each of these layers. And for the roughness, or equally you can just select the layer in here, select that, and then hit the little arrow to apply it there. So that's us applying that to the rock, and I'm going to just wait for that to finish and have a little look at our terrain after it's finished compiling. There you go. We've got our terrain, we've got our texture back, and the reason we're not seeing any textures on the sediment layer is because we simply haven't plugged the textures into the sediment layer there. So the advantage of putting that into the material function is that if we work inside of this material function, we can now update a single node graph, and every single other layer that's using this material function is going to update from it, which is really useful. And this used to be the best way of setting up a landscape layer material, and you can absolutely set things up this way yourself. You can go ahead and name all the parameters and the inputs. You can go into the landscape layer and you can do some interesting things like, let's say you want to apply the same noise to every texture to get a bit more variation. Then you could do that in here. Let's just get a simple setup to see what that would look like. T noise, and it's going to be very stark, the effect this has, because I'm not art directing this anyway at this point. I'm just testing things out. There you go. It might be a little bit hard to see. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to quickly set up that sediment layer as well. So what we're going to do here, we're going to delete that additional floating rock layer down there. We're just going to go ahead and copy this entire layer. There we go, like so. We're going to make sure that the mapping scale is plugged in. We're also going to change the names of all of these nodes. A little bit laborious, as you can tell. Lots of opportunities to accidentally misspell something or put it into the wrong group. And then we're going to, oops, daisy. We're going to grab that output pin using control and drag. We're going to delete that. There we go. And we've set up our sediment layer. And instead of applying the textures directly, hard coding them into the master material here, I'm going to apply the changes to this material. We're going to jump into the material instance and use it for what it's intended for. So we're going to go down to the sediment texture inputs that we've created. And we're going to go and find the kind of surface we want that to be. And I think I'm going to put it to be, what am I going to put it to be? Let's go for a mossy, sandy ground. Why not? So I'm going to apply that to color there. I'm going to apply the AO there. I'm going to apply the normal. I'm going to apply the roughness. And I can see something has gone desperately wrong. So this is likely to happen to you as well if you're working on landscape materials. I don't mind the fact that I'm messing things up here because it's good to demonstrate what's happening. So what's happened here? I think the problem is, let's have a little look. Sediment color. I think the problem is, I'm not sure what I think the problem is. Sediment color, parameter texture object, that's correctly named. That's correctly named. Maybe I have not applied the changes. I believe I have applied the changes. So what could be the problem? Maybe Unreal was actually just, maybe it had worked and Unreal was just taking a moment to update the display in the viewport, which you need to learn to be a little bit more patient. Let's have a little look. I mean, I would definitely say that's looking wrong. Interestingly, it actually looks kind of like right down here. And I think I know exactly what we've run into. Okay, so this is useful to bring up. One of the things that you need to bear in mind when working with landscape materials is that Unreal natively only supports a certain number of texture samplers. That's what we've run into. So if we have a little look in the material instance, you're going to see that we have this little panel on the left. It says texture samples, 3 out of 16. And that's not what I expected to see. But I'm going to go ahead and try the fix anyway. And if it works, I'll explain what I did. I'm going to jump inside of the material function. I'm going to select all the texture samples. I'm going to change them to shed wrap, including this noisy one, shed wrap. And there you go. Okay, we've now applied those layers across the whole terrain. It looks very dark, and the reason for that is because I need to just go in and remove the tints that I've applied to each of those layers. So I'm going to set them back to a nice white, nice bright white. So we're just looking at the raw base color without any tint adjustments. There we go. And you can see we're getting something now. We're getting some variation. We're getting some textures scattered across. It's still a little bit dark, and I think that's because of this noise that I introduced here. So just for the time being, I'm going to change that into an add. which is also going to produce a slightly odd result, but we're gonna just go with it so that we can see what it's doing. And notice that I'm having to go into the material function to change this behavior, to change from the texture sample source from texture asset to shared wrap. But I'm only having to do it once in the material function. I'm not having to go into the master material and do it for every layer one at a time. And there we go. Okay, so we're getting it's yeah, there you go. Okay, so I haven't really set the tiling for this noise, so I think it'd be best if I just went ahead and removed it in the interests of moving forwards. But it was more to show the point that you can just do these changes in a function and they'll update for every layer. Without this, it's going to be looking a lot better. And there you go. Okay, so that's more like what we want to see. And you can already see that it looks pretty good. You notice the tiling far away, but up close, you're getting lots of interesting variation between the two textures. And the more textures you have, the less you're going to notice that repetition. There are other tricks you can do to hide that, but that's going to be the subject maybe a little bit later on or in another tutorial. We'll talk about that. But the main thing is, for now, we've got textures on our landscape, and it's starting to sort of resemble a real landscape, at least a little bit. But this is where we're going to take another departure, and I'm just going to come out and say this is not the way that I recommend you boot and set up a landscape in 2021 in Unreal. And the reason for that is because although we can change the functionality of the function itself, which is going to update across all the layers and thus reduce the work we have to do, we can actually work a little bit smarter still. For the time being, we have to duplicate this layer every single time we want to make a new layer. We have to duplicate it, and then we have to rename every single texture. And if we set up the material function to take more inputs, perhaps we're going to have a larger scale texture that gets blended into the base color to reduce the repetition, or anything else. We're going to have to do that for every single layer, and landscapes can contain numerous layers. So we're not going to do that. What we're going to do instead, and it's something that I brought up earlier, is we're going to look at landscape. I keep doing this, not landscape layers. We're going to be looking at material layers. So material layers are an entirely new kind of, I suppose, material paradigm inside of Unreal. And they aim to keep all of the amazing functionality of working with node graphs and all of the great functionality of creating material instances and using functions to make your workflow more modular. But what they're going to do is they're going to allow you to define a layer entirely inside of a function, including all of the parameters. So you can name all of the parameters, and you only have to name them once: color, normal, roughness, ambient occlusion. You do not have to prefix them with grass. You do not have to do any of that. And this is, honestly, it sounds simple, but this is something which is a major godsend, because as you add more and more layers, all you have to do is click a little plus icon. It will create a new layer, and you can define how it blends. None of this sprawling node mess of nodes here. So we're going to kiss this goodbye. We're going to just go ahead and shut this down. We're going to save it. And we're essentially going to create the same kind of, we're going to create the same result. We're going to set it up from scratch. We're going to do it in a much more powerful and flexible way. And it's going to be how what we're moving on to now is the way that I recommend that you would approach a landscape in Unreal in 2021. But that will be the subject of the next video, which I will be releasing just later on this week, very shortly. So thanks for being patient. I'm sorry if you feel like this has been a bit of a ride where I've kind of taken you down unnecessary routes. Why not just explain it to me the right way first? And the reason is because there isn't really a right way, and it would be just as valid to create a terrain material this way. And conceptually, it's going to help, I believe, conceptually, as a beginner, this will help you to understand how we think about creating landscape materials. But this next method that I'm going to show you is going to basically put nitrous into your landscape material creation workflow, and you're going to find it probably a whole lot faster and more intuitive. But hopefully this will have created the foundation of how we do landscape materials and really showed you that there's nothing complicated about them. It's just a lot of simple behavior layered on top of each other. So thanks for listening. Thanks for your patience, and I hope that you've found this useful. You found some useful insights from the tutorial. And yeah, let me know what you think. This is still all a work in progress, this channel. I'm still learning as I go. I want to make content that appeals to people who've got a bit more experience whilst also remaining beginner friendly. This tutorial, I would say, definitely erred more on the beginner side. but the next one will take your landscape kind of materials to that next level where you could actually feasibly imagine this would be used in a AAA game, because it's a good way to do it. All right, until next time, and I will catch you then. And please don't forget, if you enjoyed this, to like and subscribe, as it really gives me a lot of motivation to continue producing this kind of content, and become maybe a little bit more in the future, maybe a little bit more independent in what I get to work on, and hopefully turn this into more of a full-time thing. So I'd absolutely love it if you guys would share this video around, and share these videos around, share this playlist. Yeah, so other topics that I plan in the future to do as well are going to be creating spline-based sort of level art tools inside of Unreal, trying to make that really accessible, as it's not really that complicated, but it can be quite off-putting. And on top of that, maybe looking at how we create foliage in Houdini, how we use Houdini to create other kinds of cool effects and modeling. Yeah, if you've got any suggestions, please let me know in the comments. Thanks a lot for listening. Bye.